Maker's Corner aboard the Villa Vie Odyssey, hosted by Kit Cassingham.
Good evening. How are you tonight? It's good to see everyone here. I'm sure you're as excited to hear this talk as I am. I was in the middle of reading Cosmos when Frank said, hey, I'd like to give this talk. So it tied in. So Frank's background is in molecular biology and biochemistry. And that's what most of his talks have been on with us. But he doesn't restrict himself to just that field of talking. Remember he did Darwin and the Beagle? Yes. It was good, another good talk. And what was there? Oh, you've had a lot of good talks.
You just can't remember them.
Because there's so many of them.
Very memorable.
They are. Yeah, they are. So anyway, he's now going to take us into space. So we're going to go with him. Humans have been contemplating alien life since humans began. I'm sticking with the story, Frank. It's true. And so Frank's going to do some exploration with them. And his curiosity is just like theirs, only different. So, is anyone out there? The real search for E.T., or as I have been teasing him, E.T. phone home. Frank Miskevich.
Thank you. So the reason I thought about this particular topic was when Kit was looking for presenters, this was just as people were getting ready for the Artemis moon mission. So I don't know if you guys have followed that at all, but it landed, about 3 or 4 days ago. And so I thought that this would be an appropriate sort of overlap with my own interests. Right? So what I'm going to talk about isn't the sort of literature of the extraterrestrials. I'm going to be talking about the science behind it. And I'm going to focus on a few different things. First of all, what is life? How do we define life? And then what kind of molecules are we going to look for that are associated with life? If you don't know what you're looking for, how are you going to know if you find it or not? Right? And then finally, I'm breaking the other part down into 2 different sections, because one of them is where might we find life, and there's more than one place we've been looking. And secondly, how are we looking there? Because depending on where you're looking, you're going to need different tools. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the tools and a little bit about what people have found so far. Right? So, what do we need for life? That's actually a really difficult question to answer, because life occupies many different things physically, and then if you start getting into the theoretical things you might be looking for, it goes all over the map. Right? So scientists have been trying to tease out what are the minimum requirements for life. And the Earth is actually a good place doing that because we actually have life here. At least we think so. Right? And so one of the biggest requirements is liquid water. We're surrounded by water. This is a good thing to remember. But water can exist in 3 different forms. You can have ice, you can have the ocean, and then you can have atmospheric water. You guys have all found that out walking around Indonesia. As soon as you go outside, you start getting drenched in water, right? And so you have these 3 different phases of water that can really exist at the same time. For life to function, you need to have liquid water. There's some things that you can dry out and it'll basically go quiescent for literally millions of years. But for it to actually do the other processes, you have to have liquid water around, as far as we know. Right? So another thing that life has to be able to do is it has to be able to, I'm going to say, manipulate energy or convert energy from one form into another. Right? Plants do this with photosynthesis. It takes solar energy and converts it into chemical energy. We convert chemical energy from the things we eat into other forms of chemical energy. Right? And so this manipulation of energy is also part of what all life has to accomplish, at least as far as we know. And thirdly, it has to grow and reproduce. Right? There are chemicals that can manipulate energy forms. You can have a solar panel taking solar energy, converting into electricity, but solar panels aren't alive because they don't grow or reproduce. So these are sort of the three basic criteria that I'm going to be talking about and using this to describe what we're looking for when we define life. And so if we can't find it, we don't know how to repeat it, we can't say it's a scientifically verifiable thing. Right? So, what's life made out of? On Earth, there are basically 4 different atoms that are essential for life. Hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. Now, it just so happens that 3 of those 4 are among the most abundant elements in the universe. So, hydrogen makes up about 76% of all mass in the universe. Helium makes up another 23%. That's 98% just in these 2 elements. Helium's not going to be involved in much of life because, well, helium's a noble gas. It doesn't do much of anything, right? It just sits there, and that's what it's really good at. Right? So this little tiny sliver down here, this 2% makes up all the other elements. I guess there's, 118 of them now? So, 116 elements make up 2% of this. Right? Of that 2%, half of that is oxygen, and half of what's left is carbon. So 3 of the 4 elements that we find essential for life actually are among the most abundant elements in the universe. So if you're going to be trying to generate life somewhere, well, naturally you'd want to have enough raw materials to start making life out of. So these are actually a pretty good starting point. Nitrogen's actually number 7 on the list. So it's fairly abundant as well. Right? Now, some people will also include sulfur and phosphorus because for our lives, phosphorus and sulfur are critical. Are they essential for all life? You can sort of manipulate that a little bit. Right? But these are the ones that are common here on Earth, and so that's a good place to start at. Right? So, when I talk about organic molecules, I'm not talking about organic as you'd find in a grocery store, right? I'm talking about molecules that contain the element carbon. And for life as we know it, 4 major organic families of organic molecules are going to make up the majority of the molecules you'll find. You're going to have nucleic acids. These are the purines and the pyrimidines that you'd find in DNA and RNA. But they're also actually key molecules in metabolism. ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine's a nucleotide. Nicotine adenine dinucleotide. NADH, NADPH. These are all supplements that you can find in the supplement aisle in pharmacies and that. And they're, again, important for metabolism and energy transformation. One of those other key elements of life. Right? The amino acids, things that make up proteins. Right? Here you have the nitrogen and the oxygens. Right? Carbohydrates, all of our favorite sugars, the sorbet and the ice creams and all of that. And then finally you have your lipids. These are going to be your oils and fats. Okay? So these are some of the key elements that if you're looking for life as we know it, you start looking for. And they're all based on those same 4 common elements. Okay? So, how are you going to manipulate these? What are going to be essential for finding life? Right? There was a guy named Stanley Miller in 1953 who came up with an experiment trying to find out, okay, here's what we think was on Earth. You have some methane, you have ammonia, you have water vapor, you have lightning, you have heat sources, you have volcanic activity. Let's see if we can mimic those early conditions and see what comes out of it. And that's essentially what he did. He set up an experiment where he had bubble or boiling water with ammonia and carbon dioxide, methane, several other chemicals, and creates boiling boiling gases that go up into the atmosphere in this case. And inside of there, he had these electrodes which he could drive sparks through. This was to simulate the lightning that I was talking about. Okay, whoops, sorry. You have a condenser down here, and then he had places that'll basically take the gas to a liquid and have it connect back up into the original pot. And then he'd let this go for a week and see what came out of it, right? What kind of molecules can you make from this primordial soup that we think was on the origin of Earth? Well, a couple molecules that came out of it were nucleic acids and amino acids. Now, they weren't quite like they find on our bodies, right? There's two different forms of amino acids. We use exactly one form of them. This method creates two of them. Some of the molecules we don't use for life, but there's enough similarity here to suggest that a lot of the molecules that are essential for life on Earth can actually be produced without life's help, right? Not exactly the same way we use them, but pretty close. So if you have similar conditions elsewhere in the universe or even in the solar system, it's quite possible that because these elements are very common, because these conditions are believed fairly common, just through these random chances, these alien organisms might use very similar molecules to what we do as well. Just because these are the common ones, and these common molecules can be made abiotically without the use of life. Right? And so the harder we've looked for these things, the more you find them. I think in 2020 or 2023, there was an asteroid return mission where basically they sent a spacecraft out to an asteroid. There was Hayabusa and another one called Bennu, where they basically collected samples and actually brought them back to Earth so they could be analyzed. And on these asteroids, they literally found the nucleic acids and amino acids that they also found in Stanley Miller's experiment. So again, the conditions that were present on Earth seem to have been present elsewhere in the solar system as well. Right? There's a Martian rover called Perseverance, one of several that we've sent to Mars. Right? One of the things it found there were these long chain carbon atoms, very similar to lipids, that are also one of the key organic molecules for life here on Earth. Right? Now, they weren't very abundant, but Mars isn't the same as it was 1 million or 1 billion years ago. Right? And so this is one of the things that people might be looking for, the presence of these organic molecules in places where there might actually be life. Right? Finally, a place that people weren't really expecting to look for life is the moon of Titan. So Titan is the largest moon in the solar system. It orbits around Saturn, which is well out there, but it has an atmosphere. And not that many bodies that could support life actually have an atmosphere. There's water on Titan. Now, from what you could see, it's mostly frozen, and it has methane and ethane rains, so it's not exactly conducive on the surface of Titan. But in the middle, based on a probe called Cassini, they found data that suggested that there might be a liquid ocean underneath the ice caps, the icy surface of Titan. You have geologic energy, right? If it's powered enough to melt this ice, now you've created another one of those conditions for life to exist, the liquid water. It may be in a rather unhealthy atmosphere outside, but if it's 2 miles under an ice cap, is it really going to notice? Right? And so these molecules can be found elsewhere, at least in this solar system. We're not as good as finding things elsewhere. Okay? So, let's think about some of the more extreme forms of life that we find here on Earth, because you never know what kind of conditions you're going to find on another planet. Okay? Sulfur is one of those elements that are also essential for life on Earth, but it sits right under oxygen in the periodic table. So it's got a lot of the same chemical properties as oxygen does. And it is also a really interesting one because, at least in some systems, it performs a function that we never use. Okay? So when they started looking under the ocean, they found these geologic vents. And these things are scattered around the world, various different places. And one of the things they found around these vents were living organisms. Now, when I'm talking about deep sea vents, we're talking a couple of miles below the ocean, right? So you have extremely high pressure. You have extremely high pressures down there. You have no sunlight whatsoever. And so these are the only organisms on Earth that don't depend upon the sun for their energy. They get their energy literally from the heat and the materials coming out of these vents. Even the so-called fossil fuels that we use all the time, they're basically the remains of plants and animals, mostly plants, from 10 to 100, 200 million years ago. Right? All that energy came from the sun and got stored. Here's a case where it's not coming from the sun at all, and it's all dependent on these plumes of gases coming out of the Earth. And what's interesting is that around these plumes, you find basically pure sulfur arranged in these intricate patterns and towers and things. Right? Sulfur is basically a byproduct. These organisms metabolize hydrogen sulfide, a gas, and deposit the sulfur as waste. Sort of like plants give off oxygen as a waste product. Uses some kinds of similar chemistry there. Right? So this is a pretty extreme example of life on Earth, but geologically dependent life, if you want to consider life on Titan, might make some sense. So another interesting element that people have at least theorized as forms of life is silicon. I don't know if you guys are Star Trek fans. Do you guys remember the Horta from Star Trek? Right? We can't communicate like Spock did with them, but it was basically a silicon-based life form. And silicon sits right under carbon in the periodic table. So it's going to have very similar chemical properties. You can have long chain silicon, oxygen, silicon things here that look very much like lipids. This is the formula for silicone oil. How many of you have ever used silicone oil for lubrication, particularly in harsher environments, some marine environments, things where you have to have a high level of low level of viscosity, I think it is. It looks a lot like a lipid. Right? You can have relatively complex atom or molecules with silicon. Silicon is one of the key features, mixed with carbon, but still something that we don't find in life on Earth, at least. But there are some drawbacks. Right? This stuff down here is quartz. Right? Silicon dioxide, sort of like carbon dioxide except in solid form. Right? Just because they're similar doesn't mean you're going to be interchangeable. So this would be like breathing out little strains of quartz crystals. Probably not very healthy for a complex life. Right? But it does interact in neat ways with water. I don't know if you guys went to some of the museums in Australia, but you would find these opalized fossils and opals in a number of these different museums. Opal is basically layers of quartz sandwiched with water in between it. So these molecules are sort of being able to separate, sort of like oil and water don't mix. Well, silicon oil and water doesn't mix either. Right? And so it has a number of the same properties, maybe not as efficient as what we have, but there are towers of sulfur underneath the ocean where the byproducts of life are there. Right? And so these are things that at least are theoretically possible in terms of the chemistry of life, how they're going to survive. Any questions on that? Okay, so place everybody looks, Mars, right? People have a long history of looking for life on Mars, right? War of the Worlds, back in 1939, there was the radio broadcast that scared half the country, right? I don't know about you, but I watched My Favorite Martian on reruns in the afternoon all the time. Okay? What's the real evidence for life on Mars, right? There actually is some, right? Perseverance, I already mentioned. They found these long-chain hydrocarbons, which, at least on Earth, is often formed by living organisms. Is it only formed by living organisms? Well, you can make lots of different conditions where it might not have been, right? So at least you find some basis for organic molecules on Mars. Right? There's also very good evidence that there was at least one time running water on the surface of Mars. Those Martian canals that people can see from the surface of the Earth, right, using telescopes, they really did carry water. Right? There is other evidence from the chemistry in the rocks and the kinds of rocks that they find. There were lakes of standing water on the surface of Mars at one point. Best guess is the most recent liquid water on the surface of Mars was maybe 1 million years ago. So nothing recent, but in terms of life on Earth, 1 million years isn't all that long ago. Right? How much more water is on Mars? Is there underground lakes that we don't know about, where to look? Good question. Can't answer that one. Right? But there certainly was running water on Mars in the past. And so what else might you find? Here's where things get a little bit confusing. On the surface of Mars, Curiosity, one of those other Martian rovers, found these really funny cauliflower-like structures in the sand in one of these abandoned lakes, or one of these dry lake beds. Okay? And these structures aren't typical of what you'd find in the terms of the molecules that make it up. There's a very silicon-rich layer. Right? But these cauliflower-like structures are actually similar to, I'm going to say, organic structures that you find in the Atacama Desert. Right? Remember when we were sailing along the coast of Chile? You had all of this desert, you had these mountains, and it was just dry. That's the Atacama Desert. It's one of the driest places on Earth. And these structures can actually be found in the mountains up there. Right? Those we know are formed by bacteria. The ones on Mars, not sure yet because we can't study them closely enough. Okay? Same thing with another structure found on Mars. Right? Again, going through these dry lake beds, or Perseverance, yet another one of these Martian rovers, right? They found these iron nodules sort of embedded in the rock in some of these places. Now, I should say also that these rovers were sent to places where they thought they could get a lot of geologic history of Mars. So they were aiming for places where these things would be found, right? But at least on Earth, there are biological methods for generating these iron nodules. Is just finding the nodule sufficient? No. Chemically, you can make these using a series of what are known as oxidation-reduction reactions. Don't want to go into details there, but basic, I know, I like the science. I'm a biologist, what can I say? Right? But basically the chemistry that would be required to form these iron nodules without life didn't seem to have any evidence for that in the area around these nodules. Not proof, suggestions that maybe that this was formed by life. How would you know? You have to actually look at these nodules under a microscope, under certain conditions, looking for particular structures, and Perseverance and the other Martian rovers just don't have the same full list of science experiments that they can carry with them. We don't know. It's suggestive of life on Mars, at least at one time, maybe millions of years ago. Whether it was there or not now, whether it was there at all, we don't have enough data to answer that question. Right? But it's thought in the past that Mars had a very similar environment to what you find on Earth today. Okay? So, how else might we find life on other worlds? Okay? Now, how many of you remember the SETI project, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence? Right? Basically, this was an effort that was designed around radio telescopes. Right? So, these radio telescopes, if you've ever been out west, some of these areas, you have these giant radio discs that they're found in arrays in the desert. And they can point at different parts of the sky and look for radio waves there. Right? So radio waves are part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Right? Same thing as light, same thing as gamma radiation. These are the very long wavelengths. Now, some of them penetrate very far through, say, the atmosphere. Right? You can have AM or FM broadcasts that are heard hundreds of miles away sometimes. Right? Other radio waves, say Wi-Fi connections, don't always penetrate as far as we'd like them to. Right? And so you have these different types of radio waves. For the longest wavelengths, basically you need these giant arrays. There's an antenna in Puerto Rico that was about a mile across that they could point in Arecibo. Right? And so this was one way you could look for these radio waves, and now you have to interpret what they mean. Right? So we use radio waves for long-distance communications. It's a very efficient form of the electromagnetic spectrum. Hey, maybe these aliens are using radio waves to communicate as well, and because they can go so far, maybe we can hear some of these messages. Right? And that's what the SETI project was all about. These radio telescopes would be able to collect information on the timing and frequency distribution of radio waves in different parts of the sky. But, this was back in the 70s and 80s that they started collecting this information, even I think into the late 60s. Right? Computers weren't as fast then. And so the analysis potential was very low. It would take a lot of computing power at the time to do this analysis. So the SETI people basically wrote a program that was the first distributed program that was run on thousands or millions of computers, where they would each analyze parts of the data. Think of it as a giant parallel computer separated by hundreds of miles. Right? This was one of the very early parallel computing projects that basically developed a number of the techniques used in modern parallel computing. Right? And they searched and searched and searched. They searched until about 2020, where the project shut down. And over all that time, almost every signal that they found, they could identify to particular natural processes. Notice I said almost. One signal in one channel on one receiver, nowhere else and never repeatable, they got this weird burst. It was somewhere around the Sagittarius, it was somewhere in the constellation Sagittarius. They were never able to find another. They never found anything similar to it again. And when the person who was analyzing the data, they were doing it by hand, and they saw this burst, they wrote "wow" in the margin of their spectrum. This became known as the wow signal because they don't have a better name for it. It was weird. It was never repeated. People have looked and looked and looked and never found anything like it again, but it's there. Right? What can you say about it? Can't call it science because it's not reproducible. They don't have a good theory for what caused it. It's this piece of data floating out there waiting for someone to figure out what it means. But that's not the only way people have looked for life among the stars. I was a graduate student back in the 1990s, and I remember very clearly when they first started finding these extraterrestrial planets or exoplanets. You can actually identify and, quote, see planets around other stars. And they do this using two different mechanisms. Okay? Basically, one way is by looking for an eclipse. When the planet passes in front of the star, it's going to block a certain amount of the light from that star reaching our sun, if the planets are aligned properly. The intensity drops, the planet keeps rotating around, goes on out the other side, the solar energy goes back up. Now, if you've all seen eclipses, you actually can measure the amount of light that gets blocked, even from as far away as maybe a few thousand light years. So these detectors, these telescopes, are extremely sensitive to the amount of light that is going to be coming from there, and it can detect things passing in front of the stars. Right? So this is one of the two mechanisms they use. The other one you can see in our solar system, but we never really worry about it. Right? Basically, whenever you have gravity attracting two objects, we think of the Earth orbiting around the sun, and it does. Right? But even though the sun puts a much stronger pull on the Earth does pull back on the sun, right? It's an attraction that goes both ways. And if you measure it carefully enough, the sun actually also sort of wobbles because it's moving around the center of mass of the solar system, right? So if you have Jupiter and Saturn and the Earth and Mars, all these other planets orbiting the sun, as they orbit, they're going to change the amount of pull on the sun, and the sun's literally going to move in space. Okay? So, if you have a large planet orbiting close to another star, right, it'll actually produce a measurable movement of that star. You can they know this very clearly from binary stars, where you can see both of them very, very well, and they'll literally both circle each other around that common center of mass. Well, that's the second method for identifying these extrasolar planets. They can see this wobbling effect. Now, you can't see it very well from Earth, right? Some of these things, the atmosphere is going to get in the way. It's going to create just a little bit of light variation, makes reproducibly almost impossible. But out in space, you have a much clearer image, at least as long as you build your telescope properly, right? And so space telescopes are actually really, really good at finding these these exoplanets. Everything from Hubble to the Spitzer telescope to the current most powerful one, the James Webb Space Telescope. I think that was brought online in 2024, right? These are really good tools because they don't have the atmosphere to interrupt them. They can detect all the wavelengths of solar radiation, which is going to be important later on this talk. Okay? Another one that NASA put up was called TESS. It stands for Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite. Its job was to look for those decreases in light as these planets pass in front of it. And it would take picture after picture after picture, looking for these dips, and then measuring how long the dips occurred and how frequently they occurred, so that you can identify the planet and get an idea of its orbit and several other characteristics. Okay? So using all these mechanisms, they're currently identified somewhat over 8,000 of these exoplanets around multiple different stars. Some stars have, I think the highest number is 7 exoplanets around them that they've identified. Right? So they're actually finding these things pretty regularly. And they also have a number of candidates, over 10,000 candidate exoplanets that they basically haven't gotten enough data to actually fully say, yes, this is clearly an exoplanet. It's a likely exoplanet. Right? So you're talking, what, 16, over 18,000 different possible exoplanets, and that's only what we can identify so far around what we can see nearby. Somewhere out there, there's probably intelligent, or somewhere out there, there's probably some form of life. Intelligent, how complex, whether it's here any longer, whether it's forming now, good questions, we have no idea. Okay? But these are some of the ways you can look for. So we have all these exoplanets. What other characteristics do we want to see? Well, one of them would be liquid water. How can we find liquid water? Well, in order to have liquid water, you have to have a certain temperature on the surface of the planet. And depending on the star it's around, that's going to vary. Right? If you're this tiny little red dwarf star, you're not putting out very much energy. You're going to have a region very close to the star that's too hot. Then you're going to have an area where, okay, liquid water might exist. And then you'll have stuff around it that's too cold. For a hotter star, as they get hotter and hotter, that inner ring of uninhabitable planets gets larger, right? Because they're just hotter, they're putting out too much energy, there's not going to be liquid water. Then you're going to have the habitable ring, and then the too cold ring, the very distant area where ice is only going to form. Right? This habitable zone is often referred to as the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, but just right, where you're going to actually have enough energy to have liquid water, not enough to boil it, not enough to have it always frozen. Right? And so you're going to be looking for planets inside of these habitable zones around the stars. Now, because of the methods that they use, we're much better at finding planets that are really close to the stars. When I'm talking close, maybe quarter the orbit of Mercury. Right? They found planets circling things really, really close. Right? But they do have about 24 to 45 candidate planets that are within this habitable zone. Some of them have been excluded based on other reasons, say the star is too variable, or it's got some weirdness to its orbit. It goes too elliptical, so it gets too cold on part of it, too hot on some of it, right? And so they've had several planets that were proven not to be in this habitable zone, but still, there are some of them that are there. Right? So that would be one of the conditions we're looking for, a temperature that supports liquid water. Well, can we find water? Right? That would be the next question. It might be liquid there if it happens to be there, but is it there? Right? So how are we going to find this? Here's where chemistry can provide an answer. If anyone out there studied chemistry somewhere in the past, you might have seen spectra that looked like this. This is called an infrared spectra of a molecule called vanillin. Thank you, Catherine. Sorry, I'm keep coughing. Yeah, I forgot about it.
Needs water.
There we go, the liquid water. I'm about to die here. No. So this is called an infrared spectrum. And this is a molecule called vanillin. It's not important, it's the flavor in vanilla, right? But the reason I'm bringing it up is because of this one functional group down here, this OH group, right? OH has a very particular absorption line in the infrared spectrum that's characteristically between 0.26 and 2.9 microns. So to give you an idea, visible light is 400 to 700 nanometers, which would be somewhere around the speaker over here. Right? This is in the infrared region of the spectrum, so it's longer wavelength, lower in energy, won't penetrate the atmosphere, partly because there's a lot of water in our atmosphere, so we'd never be able to detect this without these space telescopes. Right? And OH is a significant feature in H2O. Right? So water has a very particular absorption spectrum right in this same region. So now we're looking for stars that give off infrared radiation. Right? Well, if you look at the spectra of these stars, you guys are all seen the spectrum of the sun. When you look through a prism, you get the rainbow colors coming out. Well, basically, every star is going to have its own spectrum based upon its temperature. Right? And so the brightest stars give off more of their energy in the ultraviolet region. This is going to be the highest energy. And as you go down in brightness, you basically get more light given off in the infrared region, right? Or the red region and the infrared region would be somewhere over here, right? And when you look at these spectra next to each other, they're very different, right? The brighter stars are much darker or have much more brightness in the blue region. The cooler stars have much more brightness in the red or the infrared regions. Right? And it's the infrared that we're going to use. You can have filters that will select for particular wavelengths, basically on the particular instrument. So what you do is you would collect one of these infrared spectra from the star without the planet in front of it. You'd collect a second infrared spectra basically on the star with the planet in front of it and look for what's different. What you'd be looking for is absorption, particularly in one wavelength. In this case, looking for that absorption around 2.5 to 2.9 microns, which would be characteristic of water in the atmosphere, right? They've actually found atmospheres around several planets using the Spitzer telescope. It's got a spectrometer built into it so they can literally analyze the light that's different between these relatively small differences. All right? And so there's actually a tool or a method to find water around these planets around other stars. We're not saying anything about the water. We're not saying what kind of life is there. We're just saying that there's liquid water, there's water in the atmosphere. Pretty powerful statement, right? And in fact, they've actually built a satellite particularly to look for water in and around these atmospheres. Right? It's called Pandora. It hasn't been launched yet, but it's what's called a CubeSat. So I don't know how much you guys know about satellites, but whenever NASA has a rocket, they only make a couple kinds of rockets, right? And when you're putting up satellites, there's often extra space on these rockets that are going into orbit. Well, NASA doesn't want to waste this space, and so they have a program where you can put these small satellites called CubeSats that will literally fit in the unoccupied space on rockets that NASA's otherwise using to put something else into space. Right? They're relatively small. They're usually very inexpensive compared to the big missions. Right? A large space mission, the Spitzer telescope or the James Webb telescope was somewhere around 4 or 5 billion. I can't remember how much it was. But these aren't cheap instruments. You're not going to find them in a garage scale lab, right? These CubeSats, on the other hand, you can make, or universities will often put these together. I was working with a group down in Texas that was planning to build one of these CubeSats. They're basically given size and energy restrictions, and then if they get funded, they can build it and send them up. So you can put these together for a few $100,000 to maybe $1 million or $2 million and send them into outer space on this extra rocket space and have them carry out very particular experiments. For Pandora, that experiment is to scan these exoplanets for water in the atmosphere, looking in this infrared region, looking for places where you might actually find life. You can look for other molecules as well, right? But water's absorption is very particular, and there's nothing else to really interfere with it. And it's just a tool that we can use it to look for this water around literally other planets, which I think is really, really cool. Right? So, where does that leave us? Right? At this point, we don't have any direct evidence for life on other worlds. So I want to make that clear. Right? Scientists are very particular. You need to prove and prove again that all of your information is consistent to say, yes, there is. But, right, we do know that there was there was almost certainly running water on the surface of Mars, right? Hard to measure now, but there definitely was there. There's a liquid lake around the surface of Titan, whether it's water, how hot it is, what kind of liquid's down there, we're not quite sure, right? These exoplanets, hey, we're at least studying atmospheres of exoplanets, so whether there's life out there, who knows, right? But it's a very tough experiment, right? We may be down to looking for phone signals from extraterrestrial life saying, hello, anyone there, right? But right now, there's a lot of evidence that says at least the molecules of life are likely to be out there, and at least in some places, the conditions for life may have existed in the past. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you've got.
Wait for the microphone. They're coming around.
Frank, that's absolutely illuminating. May I ask you, in terms of the exploration of Mars, how much do we actually know about the atmosphere of Mars, the periphery of Mars, and below the surface of Mars? How much has actually been mapped?
All right. For atmosphere around Mars, now I'm going to make a distinction here because there's what is currently around Mars and what may have been around Mars in the past. Currently, the atmosphere of Mars has been measured pretty carefully. It's almost all carbon dioxide, and it's very, very low density, meaning you would not be able to breathe it even if it was oxygen there. It's very, very low. There's not very much of it. So certainly right now, Mars isn't going to be able to answer that. In terms of what's under the surface of Mars, some of the probes, Perseverance, I think, has a drill. I can't remember which one it was. I think it's Perseverance that has a drill which can go down a meter or two, right? That's as far as we've ever gone on the surface. It's very difficult to land things on the surface of Mars. I don't know if you guys remember, there have been many, many missions trying to land on the surface of Mars, and some of them crash, some of them fall over, they've had lots of problems.
That's partly why I'm asking.
Yeah, there's a lot we don't know. It's very difficult to get information. The evidence for the chemical presence of water is pretty much indisputable. A lot of the minerals that they found in these dry lake beds, at least on Earth, require the presence of water. Not recently, right? So to get to some of these mineral layers, you actually have to get off or dust off the surface dust because you have a lot of dust storms on Mars. So does that answer your question? Okay.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, John.
Frank, in your estimation, is a virus alive? And secondly, were you to find one in your exploration of Mars, would that be a priori evidence that life exists there or it's dead?
All right, whether viruses exist or is a life form or not. So viruses are a cool case where it's basically a cellular parasite. It can only grow and reproduce in the presence of other cells. So if you found a virus that was very clearly of extraterrestrial origin, I'm not sure how you'd prove that, right? But if it was different enough from everything else we know, then that would a priori suggest that somewhere out there was a form of cell that would allow this virus to infect it and grow and reproduce. So I would answer that yes, if you found a distinct virus like that, that was extraterrestrial in origin, that would be proof of some form of life elsewhere, right? Whether viruses themselves are alive, people go back and forth on this. I think they're, personally, I think they're sort of right in the middle. They require other living systems to function. They can't grow or reproduce on their own, but given the right conditions in another cell, they're able to reproduce. So they're half-live. They're a vampire form of life where they prey on this other one and suck the life out of it. Best guess I can give you, at least in my opinion. Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
I have a question. I know part of the Artemis project is looking for water at the poles of the moon. I mean, they don't have any idea that there would be any life or any organic materials on the moon. That's the first part. But the second part, is there a project to see if there's life on Earth? I'm beginning to have my doubts.
Well, I think we've got liquid water. If you want to jump off the ship, we can definitely identify that one, right? In terms of water on the surface of the moon, so the idea is that, especially in some of the shadowed regions on the moon, inside some craters, you might have pockets of ice. I think they're mostly looking for ice in these pockets in various places, also looking for subsurface ice. Water is actually a very common material in the solar system. And at least based on the evidence that we find, especially on asteroids, there are some asteroids that are coated literally in almost nothing but ice. Theoretically, there should be water on the surface of the moon, or water on the moon, and that would be a very convenient thing for the astronauts. Problem is, where is it, how much, how easy is it to get to? There's not really there's no atmosphere on the moon. It's even less than what's found on Mars, making water vapor difficult to find, right? And so it would even ice would sublimate for the most part if it had any kind of warmth at all. This is why they look in the shadowed regions of these craters where sunlight never strikes. Your temperatures are down about 5 or 6 Kelvin, about 265, 270 degrees below 0 Celsius, right? You're talking cold, cold water. And that's the only way it would be able to exist, even if it was found on the surface of the moon, as far as I understand it.
Frank, you've been talking about life as we know it, based on the requirement for water. Maybe this is getting a bit sci-fi, but there's people who believe that AI and the Internet of Things is possibly creating a self-replicating possibility of machines. And Thomas Friedman very recently talked about humans have become godlike in that they have created a new species.
All right, so whether, again, this comes down to how you're defining life. So ignoring the water part, right? You're still talking about manipulating the forms of energy and growth and reproduction, right? I don't know if you can call rebuilding something growth. I don't think people would define a manufactured limb as a natural limb, as a form of life. So I think you could make some arguments there. Whether AI is just a form of reasoning, which is what people think of when they're thinking in terms of intelligence, or whether it's a complicated series of just finding relationships and then throwing in some randomness to make things more interesting, right? The patterns that they find are found elsewhere. And that's where a lot of questions about copyright and what goes into these decisions, whether it's truly novel or whether it's stolen, nobody's answered that. And it's an existential question. I'm certainly not able to answer that one either. Personally, I have my beliefs that AI is a tool. It helps come up with possible answers, but AI is not good at sorting through the possibilities to come up with the likely ones or relevant ones. That's just from what I've seen on a lot of, that's what they call it, AI slop. That's basically, oh, we find all these things, and we tested a couple of them, so they all must be true. You know, the logic doesn't always follow. So the AI, I'm going to go no on that one for now.
Not a question, but a comment. From 1997 to 2000, my home computer ran, when I wasn't using it, was running 24/7 on SETI at home.
A lot of people's were.
A lot of, and there have been others in here doing the same thing.
I ran folding at home, so. Yeah, this was, the SETI at Home project was the first distributed distributed computing project that they ever produced. And because it was running on so many different machines, a lot of the ways that they break down problems into defined pieces that you find on parallel processors today, a lot of those first principles were worked out in SETI at Home and some of those very early distributed folding or distributed computing platforms. So it served a number of purposes, not just analyzing the data, but also building the foundation for parallel computing. And so it was a very interesting project from a number of points of view.
Hey, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that most of what we discovered in science until recently has always been an extension of what we've been able to observe. So here on Earth, the only life we've ever observed is dependent on water. What do you think the possibility is that there's a life dependent on something else that we haven't thought of because we've never observed it?
So the question was, what if there was a form of life that didn't require water, and because we've never observed it on life or on Earth, we don't know what we're looking for, right? Yeah. So my answer would come down to the chemistry, right? So for molecules to interact with each other, they don't do very well in a solid, right? When you put two solids next to one another, there's not much touching. They can't do very much. So now you're down to liquids and gases. Gases are pretty much unconstrained, so they're not going to be able to group together very efficiently. I think it'd be very difficult to get the complex interactions that we think of in terms of life of any sort to happen in a gas, right? So now you're down to liquids, right? Water or no water. One of the properties of water is that it's very polar. Okay, so water has an oxygen that has a partial negative charge on it and two hydrogens that have partial positive charges on it. Now, I bring this up because a lot of the chemical reactions that we take for granted in life and just in existence are basically where you have a solvent that dissolves different types of ions, right? Oils, ethane, methane, any of the hydrocarbons, they're never going to dissolve these ions. You need some kind of a polar molecule that's going to be able to do this. And then you can enclose those polar molecules in hydrophobic molecules, things like fats and oils, which is essentially what a cell is. You have a layer of fats surrounding this ball of liquid with ions and everything else inside of it. You'd have to have a solvent that was able to dissolve ions to help carry out these reactions, right? In terms of simple substances, about molecular abundance and atomic interactions, I think water is your best bet for all of those, just based on the chemistry and the logic and the elemental abundance and things. It's not a proof, it's just a suggestion, and that's really what a lot of this is. We're imagining how it would work but it has to be based on the scientific principles. And I know I went into a bit too much science there. I apologize. But, you know, that's when you ask a question like that, there's evidence for it. There's a reason why people think that water is an essential solvent. And I didn't go into the details, but that sort of hit some of that, more detail than I really wanted to.
All right, well, that is it for tonight. Thank you so much, Frank.
All right.
Fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.